That sounds good.
Thank you all for joining us on Zoom. I know that these days, a lot of us would rather walk into the sea than be on Zoom. So it's really exciting to see so many people wanting to have this conversation. That's really cool.
All right, so I'm gonna get us started. Thank you all for joining us. Hello and welcome to our Queer Ecology webinar. And before we introduce ourselves, there are a few things I wanted to preface with. Let me share my screen so I can show you the PowerPoint that we made. Sorry, it's loading. Oops. Present. Okay. So like I said, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We're so excited that we could have this conversation and hold this event. I wanted to just make a few little notes to preface our conversation. First of all, the three of us are not experts on this topic in any way at all. We just have the platform to hold this conversation. And so we wanted to talk about something that we're all interested in and want to learn more and want to have this conversation with all of you so that you can learn more and also teach us something. And going off of that, all of us know a little bit, and as a group, we know a lot. So feel free to chime in the chat whenever you want to say anything. And also, I believe you can raise your hand and we will call on you and give you the option to unmute yourselves and join the conversation if you have anything you want to add. And also, I want to say that the three of us are not representative of all perspectives. And so especially if you can share a different perspective, if you're a person of color or you represent a different identity that we don't and you have a unique perspective, feel free to chime in. We would love to hear from you and make this conversation as diverse and intersectional as possible.
Yeah, and on that point, these are some community agreements that are, probably if any of you work in kind of community organizing or social space at all, you've probably seen these kinds of ideas before. So like Jamie said, no one knows everything. Together we know a lot. And I think that we can all probably agree that we're here because this is a topic we're all curious and passionate about. And so, these topics are complicated. Our language doesn't really suffice in talking about some of these things because we're humans and humans aren't all that. And so I think it's really important for us to speak with care and intention with each other and also, be aware of our intent versus our impact, but also give each other the benefit of the doubt that we're exploring these ideas together. So, some other kind of community agreements are, trying to avoid jargon and acronyms. We want this conversation to be as accessible as possible. If we say some term and you're like, whoa, what? Please raise your hand, throw it in the chat, ask us a Q&A. We want this to be very non-intimidating. Yeah, and so, this is kind of just a set of community agreements you probably see a lot. And so we thought we would kind of set the tone with that. Also, we should let y'all know that this is being recorded. So, if you want to speak, but don't necessarily want your identity to be part of that, or however you want to negotiate that, feel free to change your name in your Zoom account or, DM us personally, privately, and we can ask the question without kind of putting your name on blast, or however you feel comfortable showing up here today, do so. But this is being recorded so that we can share it with other people who couldn't be here. All right,
Thank you so much, Candace. Okay, so first, I want to introduce myself. My name is Jamie Shreve. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. I am the Clean Energy Education Intern at Solar One, which is hosting this event. And I also work at the Queen's Botanical Garden as an assistant, or as a horticulture assistant. And so today I'm joined by Juniper, who works as a horticulture therapy intern at both Rusk Rehabilitation, NYU Langone, and at the St. Vartan Preschool.
Hello to everyone who is here with us today, as well as future viewers, because this is being recorded. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jamie. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm currently coming to you from Little Armenia in Mannahatta, or so-called Murray Hill, just a few blocks away from the Cove. I also just wanted to start off by acknowledging the fact that we are on stolen land and to honor the original stewards of this island and the surrounding area, the Lenni Lenape. And Candace.
Hi, everybody. My name is Candace Thompson. I accept all pronouns. I am the manager of Stuy Cove Park, which is managed by Solar One. And I'm really excited to be here today. Jamie and Amy, who work in the Green Design Lab, reached out to us to say that that Jamie wanted to have a panel on queer ecology and wanted to do it kind of in concert with the park. And I was like, great, I love queer ecology. And Juniper is awesome. So let's have Juniper be part of this conversation. And so I'm really excited to be here and to learn with everyone else. I'm currently speaking to you from my backyard in Bushwick, and my one of my closest friends, White Pine, is here with me. So say hi to them.
Hi, awesome. Thank you so much for both of you joining me. I'm so excited. So we're going to talk about a few different topics today within queer ecology. So the first is going to be queer terminology in ecology, and then we're also going to talk about relations between humans and the environment and how that relates to climate change. Okay.
Yeah, so I thought it was really interesting. I've been doing a bunch of reading in preparation for this, and I found this awesome quote from a essay written. It's actually a whole series of essays, and this was kind of the intro to it by Mel Chen and Dana Luciano. Mel Chen's work, especially with regards to non-human beings, queerness, and particularly disability, is really amazing work. So if you're a person who likes reading critical texts, then that might be something you want to look into. And I thought it was really interesting to learn that, you know, it's always interesting to kind of start with the etymology or the like where these words come from, right? And so the word queer, it comes from the Indo-European root twerque, which also yields the German quer, which means transverse, or Latin torquere, to twist, or English athwart. So queerness, this idea that like you're moving obliquely, or you're crossing against, or twisting something, right? Which I think is a really interesting, it's an interesting thing to understand that that's where that word comes from, right? That it is contingent rather than stable. I thought this was just a really nice way to kind of frame this. Yeah, and I'm not going to read this whole quote to you. And we can also share our slides with folks afterwards, because we also have a series of readings at the end if people are interested in reading more. Yeah, and then I also thought it was important to frame the word ecology, right? The word ecology comes from the root oikos, which means household, right? So when we're talking about ecology, we're talking about a system. We're talking about a house, a home, right? Like we're talking about our ecosystem. And so I think it's just really important to kind of always remember that these are the foundations on which we're having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Candace. Okay, Juniper is going to get us started off on queer language in ecology.
Okay, so as our collective consciousness continues to grow, so does our speech. Language is always evolving, therefore we must collectively work on releasing our attachments to names. Terminology is culturally and linguistically specific, so many names have been lost due to the suppression of indigenous knowledge. The language used to describe the reproduction of plants is confusing, not only because academia, a product of colonialism, purposely gatekeeps their knowledge, but also because of the fact our own human biases surrounding gender and sex are being projected onto plants. I am extremely grateful for the opportunities and resources I had access to, which allowed me to learn some of the scientific lingo. However, in my opinion, some of the most intelligent and prosperous growers I know and have learned from and about had no use for such semantics. I'd now like to generally, in lay terms, discuss and critique the words we commonly use when talking about plant anatomy and propagation. I'll be using real-life examples to guide our conversation. I will briefly define some of the verbiage, but I really don't want folks to get too caught up on that. I really want the focus of our conversation to be on deconstructing the gender binary and how our understanding of identity is being projected onto and therefore limiting our perception of our environment. Okay, so I'll be starting our talk today with the living fossil native to China, Ginkgo biloba. They are considered a gymnosperm, which is a type of vascular plant, which I like to think of as internal plumbing, that creates naked seeds, meaning they're not enclosed in a seed structure, such as ovaries, lichen flowers of your typical angiosperm, which we'll get back to if you don't know what that means. The ovules, the egg cells of gymnosperms, are exposed to the open air and are fertilized when pollen lands directly on them via the wind. So the next question you might ask yourself are ginkgos dioecious? The short answer is yes. Being dioecious means a single individual has only one type of reproductive organ and requires another individual that can generate a different but compatible gamete to mate with in order to create the next generation. If you're still not understanding what I mean, you can think of humans as dioecious. Typically, a single human can only create one type of gamete, sperm or egg, and requires another human being with the opposite gamete in order for fertilization to occur.
Okay, so before we dive even further into ginkgos, does anyone in the audience feel comfortable about defining the differences between sexual reproduction, sex, and gender? Feel free to write in the chat.
And only if you only know the definition for one, don't feel like you need to answer all three.
And it's not a test.
Yes, it's not a test.
Well, maybe while we wait, Juniper, can you explain to me the difference between a monoecious and a dioecious plant?
Sure. So this diagram actually does a really good job of showing it, because as you can see here, so the two possible reproductive organs that are typically seen as male and female in a dioecious individual, they would be on separate plants. So that's why I said humans are like a good example of thinking of what dioecious means. But monoecious means a single individual has both of the reproductive organs necessary, which you can see in C here on the right.
I also think it's really cool that when you have a hermaphroditic plant like that, right, they call it a perfect flower, right? Is that right? So yeah. It's like it has both gametes, and that makes it a perfect flower. It's funny because we're such binary thinkers. I was wondering why we would think that, like why we would call it something like that, and I was wondering if it's because like it just makes pollination easier, like I was wondering why we would frame it that way. I love it. But I wonder who decided that they would call it a perfect flower.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of critiques on that language. Someone hasn't told you today you are perfect just the way that you are.
Yes. Okay, well, Juniper, do you want to dive into the differences about sex and gender and
sure.
What you're going to say next?
Yeah, absolutely. So just like gender, human biology isn't binary either. Like practically everything in this world also exists on a spectrum. Generally, we are taught that XX is female and XY is male. But in reality, folks can be XXY, XYY, just X, XXX, among many other combinations which can manifest a wide variety of physical and behavioral characteristics.
Sorry, I need to interrupt you real quick. Someone asked if we could repeat the question. So the question was the difference between sexual reproduction, sex, and gender. So if anyone wants to answer that. Oh, thank you, Candace, for responding in the chat. If anyone wants to answer and add anything, like feel free to write in the chat, and Juniper, you can continue.
And I will do a better job of looking to make sure while I'm talking.
No, it's okay.
What's going on. But yeah, so essentially what I was saying is chromosomally, there are many combinations in humans, and that can manifest a wide variety of characteristics. So what we're taught in school typically does not account for the fact that individuals with XX chromosomes can develop testes and vice versa. Individuals with XY chromosomes can develop ovaries. Folks can also be born with intersex traits. All embryos start off with the same rudimentary reproductive tract, regardless of their chromosomes or genes. So without going too off topic, for folks that are interested, I also suggest looking into the activation of the SRY gene and the WNT4 gene, which respectively provide instructions for the embryo to develop testes or ovaries, as well as other genetic variants and a number of different genes that can alter the regulation of hormone levels. So further research around this development will help us better understand all of the beautiful possibilities. And now I guess I want to, if anyone else, yeah, no. Oh, so Michaela says, sex applies to the anatomy one possesses to contribute to reproduction, and gender is an individual's expression of their identity. Yeah, and what I was kind of talking about with, especially with the conversation around sex and anatomy, that often what we're taught in school is it's not the full picture. There are many combinations and possibilities, and it's not so simple. And I guess I wanted to talk about this because now I'm going to go back to ginkgos. My fellow city dwellers are probably familiar with the stench of ginkgo's edible but stinky, fleshy seed / ovule that's actually technically not a fruit and is often referred to as a nut. Generally, the scientific community regards the ginkgos which bear ginkgo nuts as female and those which produce pollen cones as male. However, this dichotomy does not account for the fact that ginkgos can change their reproductive structures. Typically, it is a male to female conversion. From an evolutionary standpoint, an isolated tree that has an abundance of pollen grains only needs to fertilize a few seeds. Therefore, would only need to produce a few ovules in order to self-fertilize, while still having the potential to send out enough pollen to pollinate seeds on a different ginkgo, which one could think of as creating an evolutionary backup plan. In the reverse scenario, a tree that is predominantly producing seeds, it would really only take a few pollen cones to fertilize an entire tree's worth of seeds. So instead of acting as a backup plan, it would in fact prevent pollination from other pollen producing trees, reducing genetic diversity. So in my opinion, the biological purpose of life has nothing to do with passing on of one's genes or even sex itself. Yes, a lot of behavior can be explained by the incentive of sex, but a lot of theories ignore the fact that not all variations on Earth need to have an explicit adaptation for reproduction. There are plenty of examples in life where variation that may increase the likelihood of sex actually makes operating day-to-day harder for the individual. Also, not everyone has the same desire to have sex. There are a plethora of experiences that make life fulfilling that have nothing to do with getting laid. Sometimes life forms simply just are a delightful anomaly in this extremely queer universe, and the mission is to endure for as long as we can. A unique creation formed from the endless possibilities. Yet, despite our distinctive natures, collectively, we are a mosaic of the same entity. In many ways, I think of life as a deck of cards. We are all given an unrepeatable hand, and we get to choose how we want to play / survive, depending on our environment and potentially who is there to show us some possible outcomes. But many of us know, regardless of how detailed the map or route given to us is, we are still left to figure out our own path. It's all about the journey. Because in the end, we all have the same destination, death. Luckily, the cycle doesn't end there because everyone in this Zoom call is compostable. I like to think my flesh will make an excellent meal for some flamboyant fungi one day. And if you didn't know, the sex of fungi are actually determined by variations in the genome. So there are thousands of possible unique sexes, and I'm not qualified to talk too much on that, but if you're interested in, fungi are very, 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 very queer.
Thank you so much, Juniper. Candace, I'd love to hear from you about chimps and bonobos.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, I just wanted to say kind of on the fungi point, like I've been listening to this Nature's Rainbow, which is a book by Joan Roughgarden, who, if you don't know, is a trans evolutionary biologist. And like just on my way home today, I heard that there are tropical gingers that in the morning are male, like some will be male, or some will be producing pollen, we'll say, and some will be receiving pollen, right? And then after lunch, they're like, flip, and they start doing the opposite every day, right? And so like, or clownfish who live within an anemone, and if their partner dies or gets eaten or, you know, something, or a new partner shows up and they happen to be the same gender, one of them would be like, well, this isn't gonna work out, and they flip. And so like, I just love kind of the fact that all of nature is adaptive and diverse enough to be able to try and survive, to try and kind of continue life on this planet. And I think one of the kind of classic examples you always hear about the ways that we as humans kind of place our value systems on these things is, you know, a lot of the people who studied chimps in the, you know, last century, where I was born, were white men from Europe, right, who went to Africa, and they found chimps, and they were like, chimps, they're aggressive, they're patriarchal, the men often like attack other males and sometimes even kill children and are very territorial, right? And they were like, look, our closest relative. See, they thought they were being objective and observing how they behave, but then they were like, see, that justifies why we are the way we are. But they hadn't found bonobos yet, who we also share like 90% or 98% or 99% of our DNA with, who are matriarchal, where the elder females in the community determine where they travel, who eats, who breeds. And one of the best ways that they resolve conflict, they're not fighters, they have gay sex. And that is how they resolve conflict. That's how they kind of show affection for each other. And so like, both of these are our closest relatives, you know? And so like, you can't say, well, see, that's how we're supposed to be. It's all part of it, you know? So yeah, I just thought that was such a good example to kind of remind ourselves consistently that like, there are monoecious, there are dioecious, sometimes they're hermaphroditic, sometimes they're not. It's all about context, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Candace. I wanted to add that going off of how some species might change their sex during the day and stuff, or like when a new partner comes that's the opposite gender, I have seen that concept a lot in science fiction with like aliens, but it's actually much closer to us than these species that we're making up and putting in fiction novels. It's, you know, right here in plants and animals around us. Okay, going back to Juniper.
Yeah, so now we're going to talk about angiosperms, which are our type of vascular plant that creates flowers. More specifically, I wanted to focus on the language around flower structure variation because I find it to be particularly problematic. So scientists, if you guys remember from the other slide, scientists discuss flowers as either bisexual or unisexual. But before I kind of go into what these terms mean, does anyone feel comfortable defining what bisexuality means for humans?
I'll type it.
Kylie says,
Kylie.
Yeah, attraction to more than one gender. Yeah, so bisexual flowers are also called hermaphroditic because they have both the pistil, which is typically referred to as the female part, as well as the stamen, which is commonly referred to as the male part. This is obviously not the same thing as the human experience of bisexuality. The term inherently kind of confuses anatomy and sexuality. Unisexual flowers are defined as either carpellate or pistillate or staminate. Carpellate and pistillate being for the female and staminate for the male. And they're legitimately called, as Candace mentioned before, imperfect or incomplete flowers, making bisexual flowers perfect or complete. A flower having sepals, petals, stamens, and pistils is complete. If a flower lacks one or more of these whorls, it is said to be incomplete. Like I said before, I'm not really in a position to declare what the right word is, but I can definitely tell you that the language we use now is rude, misleading, and has a lot of room to grow. So I don't know if anybody has if anyone off the top of their head has a better word they'd like to share with the group. I'd love to hear it, because I'd love to change my language around this as well. Regardless, I think all flowers are perfect.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Juniper. What are some examples of language evolving over time, and how does language surrounding plant reproduction need to change? Juniper.
Oh, sorry, I thought that was
oh, no. Oh, no. Sorry. Yeah, if anyone wants to like answer that question, or Juniper, you could like go on if you want.
Well, I just think, for example, a word when we talk about for humans that has changed, a very popular term for transgender people was transvestite once upon a time. And that language has obviously changed. So that's just one example of, once upon a time, that word was used widely and from the individuals of this group, but now it no longer is. So going back to my original point about how language is always changing and evolving, we kind of need to release our need to have specific names for, specifically when we talk about plant anatomy and reproduction. I think that language needs to shift. And I know there's quite a bit of resistance within the scientific community, because I understand why we create these terms in the first place is so everybody knows what they're talking about. But like I said earlier, language is specific to culture, to language, to so many different factors. And therefore, there is no such thing as the right or the best word. But because, yeah, because my name is Juniper, I also thought it would be fitting to kind of briefly talk about juniper berries. There are many kinds of junipers. Typically, the ones that you can purchase at a local herb store are from the common juniper. Their best known use today is for being the main flavoring agent in gin. Juniper berries are actually not even berries. They are ovulate cones with merged fleshy scales, which are modified leaves. You might perceive them as berries, but that doesn't mean that they are. Same thing with gender. We need to eliminate our preconceived notions of what someone should look like. The expression "never judge a book by its cover" really fits well here, because whenever you're meeting someone for the first time, you want to create a safe space for others by introducing yourself with your pronouns. That's kind of why we started the session this way, to remove any preconceived notion of what you think someone might be. I also just think it's weird behavior to go around assuming associating the fact that you see someone, you might think what kind of genitalia they have. Like that's not okay. And the same thing with an example here. Kylie has put in an example of language change is racial terminology. Yeah, so from instead of saying Caucasian, we say white. And I'm not going to say the other words, but we now use for another common word that people will use in America is African Americans, and now we use it's more commonly it's used to say is to call someone black, and using a capital B. And
Yes.
here on the slides, I've created and this is by no means a complete list, but includes some neopronouns for those who aren't as familiar. But here's another example of how language has changed.
Yes, thank you so much, Juniper and Kylie, for those examples. Those are awesome. And just to reiterate, language is always changing in queer spaces, in everyday language, and terminology shifts. So we shouldn't be so attached to it. Like Juniper gave the example of transvestite and transgender, queer terms have changed and evolved, and the labels mean different things to different people, and people will choose to identify or not identify with those labels because of the labels and their ever-evolving meanings. And also, it's not just something that's exclusive to queer people or other cultures. It's also just something in everyday language, you know, the definition of words changes all the time. I think that the word literally has the word figuratively as a definition now because of how it's used in slang. And also people will say things like, I could care less, when they mean I couldn't care less. So stuff is just always changing. And I don't know, I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think that it's great that we live in this world, but it does make things confusing sometimes. And a lot of terminology can still make people uncomfortable and not exactly fit right. So it's good to challenge those notions. And now I'm going to go back to Juniper.
Okay, so I'm gonna end my little section of my spiel here by sharing a post with all of you, an Instagram post by Farmer Rishi, which I really enjoyed, and I highly recommend you guys check out their Instagram. But we'll kind of go through like a guided little thought or a meditative, a time for reflection, let's call it that. So the first slide says, nature does not exist. Close your eyes and imagine nature. Give yourself a minute to fly around the image you've created. So we'll give folks a few seconds to kind of start to think about what is nature to them. Okay, did you see beautiful forests, vast oceans teeming with fish and whales? Did you see national parks you visited? Did you see any people? Did you see any buildings, homes, cities, any human creations at all? The Oxford Dictionary defines nature as the phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to humans or human creations. Nature is one of the fundamental colonial constructs that violently divides us from our earth body. Nature is defined by what is not us and by what we haven't touched. Human touch defiles and creates artifice from nature/natural materials. Humans land on nature rather than arising from earth. Nature does not exist. Earth does. We do not need to reconnect to earth. We are earth. We wake up as earth. We eat earth. We breathe earth. All we know is earth. Our homes, our cities, our plastic, our petroleum, our chemicals, all earth. And also our beauty, our art, our creations, our emotions, our bodies. Nature and the natural/unnatural binary blind and confuse us. So natural immunity. All immunity is inherited, some from your mother's breast, some from a vaccine. Natural food. All food comes from the earth. What foods contribute to any individual's health vary from person to person and even day to day. Nature is modest and fragile. She needs our protection. Really? Earth is a sex crazy beast that is always undergoing change and transformation. Try to keep up. Nature as a colonial construct is deeply entwined into colonial culture, including academics, science, entertainment, and the environmental movement. Nature is imagined as a previously existing pure state that we must return to that exists outside of us. Naturalists and environmentalists study the world that is not us. Biomimicry asks us to imitate a life that we are not a part of. Like the colonial constructs of gender, sex, race, intelligence, species, and morality, nature and the natural/unnatural binary have no basis in reality. Our language, schooling, movies, scientists, economics, political leadership, and environmental leadership simply repeat these concepts continuously so that we never question their existence. You are Earth every day. Your needs are Earth's needs. Taking care of yourself is taking care of Earth. Healing yourself is healing Earth. And I highly recommend, if any of that meant something to you, changed your mind, opened your eyes, definitely Venmo Farmer Rishi over there. And this will also, like Candace said before, we're going to be sharing these slides. So if you didn't get a chance to jot it down, please do consider sending monetary value to them.
Thank you so much, Juniper. That was so great. And that was so calming. I feel like I just did meditation. So leading off of our discussion about human terminology that's attached to the earth, I wanted to discuss how the planet has been anthropomorphized and what that means for the planet. So we have anthropomorphized the environment, meaning that we apply human concepts and labels to the environment, like Juniper was just talking about, labeling plants as bisexual or like male and female parts, when really those terms don't make sense because plants and other animals are completely different from us. And we've also deemed plants inanimate, meaning that we call them it, even though they're alive. And this is an interesting dichotomy because we, as humans, have both separated ourselves from the natural environment and also applied our own concepts to it, and applied our own concepts and our own understanding of our bodies and our systems to plants and animals, which are very different things from us. And they have different reproduction methods, different genders, different quantities and types of those things. So I'm going to read a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. In this excerpt from the text, she's discussing how humans use pronouns like they, she, he, etc., but only label plants as it. So it robs a person, this is the beginning of the quote. It robs a person of selfhood and kinship, reducing a person to a mere thing. So it is that in Potawatomi and other indigenous languages, we use the same words to address the living world as we do for our family, because they are our family. And I just thought that that was a really beautiful thought. And when I read that, it made me think about nature in a different way. Instead of this dynamic of humans having more control and power and authority over nature. So what are some consequences of anthropomorphizing nature? And how might this affect or alter human perspective on plants and natural systems? So in my opinion, the anthropomorphization and lack of animation of plants has allowed people to not care about our impact on the planet. So in human minds, it's ours to take and use as we please. And if our society had a culture of treating nature with more respect, like the indigenous people do, then maybe more people would have a different perspective and attitude towards the planet and climate change. And I see someone wrote in the chat, plant blindness. And if anyone else wants to expand on that thought or write anything, or Juniper or Candace, if you want to add anything, like feel free to.
Yeah, that's plant blindness is something that I'm really trying to help fight against, especially with my fellow friends who have grown up in an urban environment like this. I can't go down a street without peering into the street trees and what people are growing in those little plots. But most of us, whether it be we're looking on our phones, looking at what's going on around us, we tend to ignore what's growing right in the, even in this urban jungle, there's still things growing within the cracks. And I think part of, being more in touch with the moment comes with also being aware of what is living around you, and not just seeing as what Jamie said before, plants aren't its, or like, inanimate objects. They are also life, and they are also part of us as well.
Thank you for that.
There's a really great book by Gregory Cajete called Native Science. And much like Dr. Kimmerer, he talks a lot about kind of indigenous ways of knowing, right? And so I think it's really interesting to kind of draw a differentiation of what we're talking about when we're talking about anthropomorphization, because in a lot of kind of indigenous epistemologies or ways of knowing, right, you do tell stories that give human traits to non-human beings, right? So you would say, oh, the north wind does this, and therefore that is why this happened, right? That would be like part of a story that is passed down through generations. And they use stories to be able to understand their world, right? As opposed to, oh, the north wind comes because, and then hand you a textbook and you're supposed to try and absorb that, right? And so it's a very different way of kind of thinking. It is called Native Science by Gregory Cajete, I believe. Let me just check to make sure his first name is Gregory. But I think it's really interesting to kind of differentiate between when we're objectifying nature, right? We're saying, oh, that it's an object, and when we're making it a fellow subject like ourselves. And so that's where I sometimes use this phrase, like, I'm not, I often think of myself as trying to planthropomorphize humans. So look at the way the natural world works and see the similarities and the kinship in human culture, right? As opposed to assigning human culture to nature, right? So it's kind of flipping that for me, and that's the best word I've kind of come up with so far for how to do that. But I do think, yeah, I often personally kind of buck against the kind of traditional scientific philosophical, oh, we shouldn't anthropomorphize, because I think, once again, that's a binary, and that's a should and a shouldn't and a value judgment, when there are ways to think about non-human personhood that finds our kinships and our similarities without kind of necessarily making it something else, or making it a resource, or projecting onto it, you know?
Thank you so much. And yeah, if you want to expand more on that, the next thing I was going to ask, or if anyone else wants to add to this, what similarities are there between humans and nature, and how can we use this information to build respect for the planet?
Is that for everyone?
Yes, you can
great.
keep if you want to, or anyone else. And also, thank you everyone who's been writing in the chat. I'm loving these comments.
Yeah, awesome. I will say I've also been challenging myself. You know, I've often used the word plant blindness, and I've been thinking a lot about how ableist it is. And so I've been trying to figure out what word would be the opposite, right? To be ignorant of plants, right? Or to be like, what is that word, right? For just not noticing. So that's once again one of those evolving terms that we have to recognize, like exclude some people that maybe it doesn't intend to. But yeah, Kylie, your Braiding Sweetgrass is so good. If anybody here hasn't read it, you should right now. Let's see.
And you make a great point, Candace, also like how it very much is in ableist terms. And actually, arguably one would say when vision is no longer a part of your sensory experience, you're actually, one would say there's plenty of, I believe it's, I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but I believe it's one of Helen Keller's, one of her shorts, excuse me. She's discussed a lot about her experiences with touching moss, for example, and that being extremely soft, like things, you know, other sensory experiences where actually she was more in tune with her nature and with her environment, with the earth. And you didn't necessarily need to visually see those things in order to experience it. So yeah, plant blindness wouldn't make sense, because there's other ways to be aware of your environment other than vision.
I wanted to read that Kylie said, I love braiding sweetgrass. I've done lots and lots of reflecting since, and try to recognize when I refer to animals, plants, and other wildlife and forms of nature as it or they, speaking directly to them. I often remove myself from being present to the being by speaking in third person to others or in my head, or when I speak directly, it helps me to work through that plant blindness. Yeah, that's interesting. And it's funny too to like think it's so funny, we're as humans we always like make ourselves the main character. Like we think we're out in the forest and like, oh, I'm gonna talk to they're all having a conversation without you. Like they you know, it's funny to try and like decenter ourselves from these conversations as much as possible. I'm trying to differentiate which ones are to the panelists and attendees. So the rest are all to everybody, so I don't feel the need to read them.
Yes, I wanted to read something that Toby said. Maybe not a similarity, but we replicate nature all the time, biomimicry and engineering. So clearly we can apply our observations from nature onto human endeavors and benefit from that. Yes, I think that there's a lot of connections between humans and nature, but we have sort of built this wall of like, well, we're more intelligent, we invent things, and you're just a plant that grows. And it seems really, I don't know, it seems neglectful. I feel like there's not as much honoring of the planet as there should be, given all that it provides for us. And I think that that's upsetting. And I think if more people read books like Braiding Sweetgrass and had a better understanding of nature and thought about nature in a different way, a different perspective than just I'm stronger than this thing, then I think that would impact how we deal with climate change. I think people would be more respectful, and a lot of people would take climate change more seriously and would take the damage that we cause the planet more seriously.
And I just wanted to share the quote that Muggsy put into the chat, because that was kind of what I was thinking of. The quote is, "To me, a lush carpet of pine needles or spongy grass is more welcome than the most luxurious Persian rug." That's a Helen Keller quote, which I find to be particularly amusing, because I do have many Persian rugs in my home, and I can say for sure that spongy grass and pine needles definitely feels better.
Yeah, Jamie, you brought up a word that I thought about a lot in the past couple of weeks in thinking about this topic, this idea of kind of dominance or control, right? And that like so much of even queerness as a concept comes out of kind of a dominating narrative of heteronormativity, right? I read that like homosexual wasn't really a term until the late 1890s. Before then, of course, there was the Christian church, and you know there were persecutions against people who practiced other forms of sexual congress, but there wasn't like a type. There wasn't an identified type. And yeah, hubristic is definitely a good word. Toby said that he thinks hubristic might be a good word for what we're doing, is separation and superiority. Yeah, and so that this idea that we're gonna like go in and control nature. It's even about climate change, like, oh, we're gonna fix it. Nothing's ever fixed. No system is static, right? And so much like our sexuality, much like how the planet is going to continue to change and evolve, we have to be able to be as fluid and as spectral as it is, right? And the idea that we're ever going to be able to pin anything down onto a mat and say how it functions forever is hubristic, definitely hubristic.
Okay.
To share what Jillian,
go ahead.
Sorry, Jamie. I also just
want go ahead.
Share what Jillian put in the chat. I'm not sure if that was said yet, but apparently there is a human in their agroecology class who refers to plants as relatives. I love that. I really like that. I think that I'm going to start doing that myself because they are, and it just makes more sense.
Yes, I also love that. I'm also going to read what Kylie wrote in the chat. Also, I've been practicing greeting the life around me and asking for consent to enter when I approach natural spaces by looking, listening, sensing responses, but have also been working on decentering myself and remembering the space isn't revolving around me, even if we're interacting. That is a lovely thought. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kylie. I have one more question for Candace and Juniper, but if anyone has any burning questions they want to put in the chat or raise their hand and have us unmute them, feel free to do so while I ask Juniper and Candace one more thing. So Candace and Juniper, what changes have you made in the green spaces you care for to incorporate these morals regarding the earth that we have been discussing for this hour?
So I'll let Candace talk about the Cove, but when starting my internship at St. Vartan Preschool back in May of last year, I began a composting initiative. So I either chop and drop, which is a nicer way of saying I cut things and leave it on the ground, or I take the plant material gathered from that day with me home. The school has a really beautiful perennial garden, and because of this change, there are even more flowers than there was before. And it's very much like a, the grass is hardly ever mowed, so it's nice and long and lush, and all of the perennials are all along the borders of the gates, so it is just full of life in there. And yeah, just an adjustment of no longer just throwing out the plant material. The space looks so beautiful. So that's my little contribution.
Yeah, and I guess I want to answer this question by kind of framing who I am and how I approach it. So I don't have a horticulture background. Spoiler alert, I manage a park. I don't have a horticulture background. And I am not a landscape designer. For the past 15 years living in New York, I've been an artist who has built work around community and with and for community. And for the past 5 years has been making work in collaboration with plants and other non-human beings in service of getting humans to reconnect and stop disassociating from their relationship to, how do I even say, to themselves as embodied in the earth, right? And so, all of these ideas that are kind of present in this notion of queer ecology, challenging these binaries of what is right and what is wrong, what is gay, what is straight, what is native versus invasive, what is good, what is bad, right? I definitely bring that to how I manage the park. It is a wild space. It is not. It started as a very passive use. You stand on the path, you look at the plants. Every plant has its place. This is a nice place. This will make people's apartments worth more kind of space. And in the 20 years that it has existed, and through all of the hands that have touched it, it has grown into a far more complex and nuanced ecosystem. So when I am in that space working, I'm not trying to just make a pretty place. I'm trying to tell stories and engage community through plants and through food and through land work, right? And so, this past week, Toby, who's on this call, and some other people were helping me kind of repair a hugel that I built with a bunch of volunteers last year. And it's not in the greatest shape, right? Because it's not about making something that's perfect and pristine. It's about stuff that is constantly in flux. It's about educating myself and others and experimentation, which I think kind of speaks very clearly to how the kind of framework of queer ecology is all about, how all of us and all of nature is constantly in flux and constantly adapting. And queer ecology is a conversation, much like my work at that park is a constant conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
Yes. Does anyone else have any questions? I do. I'm going to share my screen for a second because we have some. No. Oh, okay. 1 second. We have a list of further reading, some things that we have read and took some of our information from, and some things that we think would be good recommendations for you all. So again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to write in the chat, and I'm just going to share my screen so that you guys can see all of these. So this is some further reading. We're also going to send you these slides, so if you miss it right now, you'll have access to them later, but I just wanted to show you guys these real quick so you can get started on reading before we even send you out and send you the slides out. And we also have another slide. Sorry.
I just want to shout out the Ecosexual Manifesto. The Ecosexuals are hilarious and fun. They are a queer couple from San Francisco who do performance projects where they go around and marry. They married the Appalachian Mountains because one of them is from there, and they made a piece to kind of once again imbue non-human personhood to have a conversation about mountaintop removal. And I just think they're freaking delightful. So you should check out the Ecosexuals. I definitely identify as an ecosexual.
Awesome. Okay, let me go to the next slide. We also have resources on ginkgo, fungi, and juniper berries.
Just want to thank everyone again for participating and being here, part of this conversation that will continue to go on for far much longer than this 1 hour session.
Yes. Okay, so it's just about 8, so we're going to wrap it up now. But thank you all so much for joining us, for participating. This was such a lovely conversation. It was everything I hoped it could be. Thank you again, Candace and Juniper, for joining me. And I will be sending a follow-up email to you all in a few days. So if you think of any more questions later on, you'll be able to contact us if need be. Yes, I'm seeing lots of thank yous in the chat. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Jamie, for organizing. Thank you, Juniper, for holding it down. And thanks everybody for coming. Yeah.
All right.
I'm going to stop recording.
Yes.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.